Gold Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barley, who leads us through the history of British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest, and this year we're actually going to be wandering a little further afield than that, aren't we?
Yeah, a little bit, Mike. Most of our programs concern British Columbia. One in the Yukon, one in Alberta, and two in the northwestern part of the United States.
We're talking about a place now which I guess can be called in the boundary country of British Columbia, Greenwood.
Yep.
What's special about Greenwood?
Well, I think it's one of those fascinating towns in the province. It's one of the last of the two great mining towns that is still virtually intact. Nelson is the other. And it's still known as the smallest incorporated city in Canada, which it is. It comes by that title. It's a bona fide title.
And what kind of ore was mined out of this area?
Basically copper, although the silver and gold in the immediate region. But, you know, when you name your main street Copper Street, well, it's got to be a copper town, which it was.
Okay. Greenwood, and some treasure stories toward the end of the show when we come back from this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barley, and we're talking today about Greenwood. It's on Boundary Creek. I said it was in the boundary country.
Yep.
When are we talking about? What era did they discover mineral here?
Mike, we're talking about the 1890s, and essentially 1896, 97, 98, when the miners began to stream over the Dewdney Trail, following Boundary Creek, and then going into the West Kootenay country. And then they came in and established a town, established by an Okanagan resident, a man called Robert Wood, and he named it Greenwood. And this is one of the earlier shots of Greenwood, 1898, and it shows the beginning of a formation of a really quite significant mining camp.
That street that you see heading up the mountain there, it headed to another very famous place.
Ah, yes, it headed towards the famous ghost town of, which eventually became a ghost town of Phoenix.
Greenwood. And it was a bustling place. I just love this fellow sort of vaulting off his buckboard.
Oh yeah, this is one of the classic shots of the old town, a mining town, you know, just getting underway, and you see the various hotels. And this is Copper Street. This is the main street of Greenwood, bustling and hustling for about 5 years before it really kind of settled down.
See the power poles there? So they had some aspect of electricity or telegraph?
Oh, sure they did.
Yeah. 1898, something like that?
1898 or 99.
There were a lot of places in this area. You were mentioning a few, but Anaconda, I mean...
Anaconda was a neighboring town. It was a rival for a very, very short time with Greenwood, just to the west of Greenwood, and this shows a shot of Anaconda. So they passed Anaconda to get into Greenwood, essentially, but Anaconda did not last, whereas Greenwood did. Anaconda was one of these fleeting camps, like Eholt, like Deadwood, like, you know, there were a lot of camps in and around Greenwood that were very fascinating mining camps. There was Providence Camp, and there was Skylark Camp, and there was Deadwood, and you know, half a dozen camps in the immediate vicinity, north, south, east, and west of Greenwood. So Greenwood was the natural center.
Yeah. I have a piece of iron here. I think we've alluded in a previous program to a sort of a recreation that miners did on special days, but this is a tool. What's it do?
Well, it's drill steel, and of course, you could either use that single jacking or double jacking, and single jacking means one man had to turn that an eighth of a turn each time and hit it with a sledge, which was very painstaking, very slow. Usually it was done with a two-man team. One man turned the steel, the other man hit with the sledge, and then they would change about every 15 minutes, so one man wouldn't get too tired, because naturally the turning is easier than hitting with a sledge.
Yeah, and if you trusted the man hitting. This was also, the sport I associated with was, you know, like on Dominion Day they would have contests.
Drilling contests, sometimes $1,000 first prize.
But boy, I wouldn't want to do this for a living, and that's what they had to do for a
living.
living.
Very dangerous work.
The next process, of course, was the infusion of some sort of explosive device in the hole they just created.
Yeah.
These are wonderful things. Look at this. Blasting caps.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
And they meant dangerous. When we were kids, one of the kids in our neighborhood had part of his fingers blown off because he was a little careless with the blasting caps. And we were always very, very cautious when we went through the old mines, because quite often, Mike, some of these were left behind. And when we saw a blasting cap box, we handled it very, very gingerly.
your collections you've got artifacts and various other things,
Yeah.
but some of the most interesting stuff is the written material.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
these weren't prospecti for
No.
mining companies. What were these exactly?
Well, these were a memorandum which showed the formation of the company, who the officers were, and how many shares were to be issued, and so on. So it differed a little bit. This is about 1899. These particular. They were a stock promotion, essentially. They were going to form the Little Bertha Mining Company and so on.
Did the Little Bertha Mining Company ever come to anything?
Well, the Little Bertha was a prospect, but never really got off the mark.
But some mines did get off the mark, and they were smelters. It was a full-blown operation here.
Yeah, this was a big mining camp. And this is one example. This is one of the largest smelters in the British Empire at that time.
And what was this one?
And this is the British Columbia Copper Company. And this is right near Greenwood. In fact, you can see the remains of the stacks and the slag heaps and so on right next to the town of Greenwood.
How much ore would they put through? Would this come out in copper ingots, or what would happen with
most of this ore came from a camp just to the north of Greenwood, kind of the northwest, and this was the Motherlode mine, so-called Deadwood Camp.
Yeah. This is a different company,
This is
but
another
look
one.
at the size
This
of
is
this.
another smelter, which is about 3 miles away, and this is west of Greenwood. And this smelter is the so-called Sunset Smelter, Dominion Copper Company.
And a huge operation. And its slag heaps are obviously well established too.
Yeah, and it drew ore from the number 7 and so on, other mines close by. Although it didn't last like the mine at Greenwood, at least the smelter at Greenwood itself.
A guy working in a smelter could work up a royal thirst. This is a brewery. What's the name of this brewery?
Well, this is the Elkhorn Brewery, and probably named after the Elkhorn Mine and the Elkhorn Camp, and owned by the Portman family. And you will see they're the Portman family on the left of the screen.
They all got a jug of beer in their hands
and
too.
they're sampling their own, sure.
And the man in the background with the dog next to him on the wagon and the beer kegs there.
Yeah, a classic photo. Nice
That
photo.
is a wonderful photo. Who are these guys?
Yeah, that's Portman on the left, and on the right is Carl Tomet. And Carl Tomet was a hotel keeper in Midway. He was eventually shot to death in a holdup, and I think it was 1909. So he came to an untimely and rather early death.
This is a beer bottle. Bottle collecting was very big, I guess, through the 60s and 70s at a time.
Mostly the late 60s, right.
Yeah, and this was a beer bottle, and
Yeah.
a very rare one, you say.
Yeah, this is Dorian Marstrand, and this is a rare beer bottle. And you know, any embossed bottles, Mike, tend to be rarer than bottles that are not embossed. Now there are 3 molds and 2 molds and various tints of. Sometimes you get a red bottle, sometimes black, sometimes green. You know, usually they're amber or green.
Was this corked, or how did they stop up
No, there would actually
effervescent?
be a lock top on that, and I'm not an expert in it, but quite often there was a little top inserted right in
and
it
it would
with a
lock
wire.
down
That's
on the
right,
bottom.
with a wire top.
Now, this looks like gin to me, but I could be mistaken.
And that's a little later. That's about 1920, whereas this one's considerably earlier.
And there's would this classify it as an embossment?
Yeah,
Does that make it a little snazzier?
That's an embossment, yeah.
And this one looks like maybe it had something effervescent in it too, because it had a rim top that probably could be locked in there.
Yeah, usually they did have.
Were you big on bottle collecting at any time?
No, I have about 50 or 60, but I wasn't especially interested.
Up on the top here, it says J.W. McCreath.
McCreath, yeah. McCreath was a brewer and a wholesale liquor vendor, actually, would be a better description than McCreath. And he was quite an interesting character in Greenwood. He was a pretty hard man. And the McCreath jugs are rather difficult to get now.
What would be in this jug? I mean, I've seen people.
Well, it'd be
hoist them
similar
like
to the
this.
Manley Miller, at least the Manley brothers in Grand Forks. That would be wholesale liquor.
Whiskey?
Yeah, probably.
This was a week supply.
Well, yeah,
It's
maybe.
a fair chunk of hooch in there.
Yeah.
So these people liked their recreation. They liked a little top of ale occasionally. About how many people were we talking about in this country?
Well, we're talking about the town that at that time was bigger than Grand Forks. It probably hit the 3,000 mark very briefly towards the end of the century. Had 12 hotels, had 2 newspapers, a railroad, virtually all, an opera house, virtually all the amenities of an incorporated city, which it was. 1897 it was incorporated.
Now, if you were to go to Greenwood today, the street you see right down the middle that's Highway 3 on
That's Highway
the Crow's
3.
Nest route.
That's right. You go up Highway 3, and you can see you still travel along that particular road today, and then you turn right, sharp right, and then you go down Copper Street itself, which was the main drag of Greenwood, which hasn't changed that much.
And it would go up the street to the right at that point, eh?
Yeah.
As far as parades, we alluded to these before. There's always a reason for celebration. This would be circa when and what do they celebrate?
Well, it'd be circa 1899, probably Dominion Day, but I'm not sure. One of the holidays for certain because of the decorations around town. And, of course, everyone loved a parade. Usually it gave the miners a day off, which was unusual. So they'd have all sorts of, they'd have horse races, fights, and so on. Some fights which weren't scheduled either.
This is a wonderful looking structure. What is it?
Well, this is the Rendell block this is one of the larger business blocks in Greenwood, and that's just under construction. This is probably taken about 1898, I think, Mike.
It's got some bunting on it, a British flag and an American flag, so they're celebrating some joint holiday again, obviously.
That's
the American
right.
influence pretty strong in the boundary.
Oh,
country.
very definitely. And remember, this town was only about 7 miles or 8 miles north of the international boundary.
This is an old hand-colored postcard a little later into the 19-teens,
This is about 1908, actually, Mike. 1907, 1908. And by this time, Greenwood's population has slipped from the 3,000 mark, which is the high water mark, right down to about 1,500. And so it is still a city, it is still fairly important, but it isn't booming like it was in the 1890s, you know.
And it had all the hotels and everything. You already,
sure did.
You already mentioned that there were a couple of newspapers. This is the Ledge newspaper.
That is one of the most famous newspapers in British Columbia, put out by what I consider the most clever of all the editors, and this is Robert Thornton Lowry, whom I consider a better editor than virtually anybody in the West, including Bob Edwards of the Calgary Eye Opener.
Now, what made him a good editor?
Well, he had a way with words. He could tell a good story. His newspapers were unfailingly interesting, except for the last several years of his life. He died in 1921.
There's really a wonderful little segment here called Western Float, and it's just one-liners of fascinating stuff. For example, golf is going to be starting up again in Headley, and this was published March 27th, 1913, so that was a good enough year so that the golf course at Headley could be reinstituted.
Sure.
And there's, you know, when I think of these miners, I always think of somehow it's a small operation, but here they're talking about Paul Nelson, died in the Phoenix Hospital last week from injuries he suffered in an accident at the Gold Drop Mine. He was 23 years old.
Yep.
In one blast at the Mother Lode Mine last Friday, about 10 tons of dynamite was used, and several men were rendered unconscious for a time when they went back into the mine too soon.
Yeah, well, you couldn't go back into the face where the blast had occurred, because otherwise the cordite fumes and the other fumes would render you unconscious very quickly. Sometimes it would be proof fatal. So they'd have to be very careful. They'd have to let the fumes clear before they went back in.
And this is still a fascinating newspaper to read right today.
Oh yeah, he was a genius as far as a newspaper editor was concerned.
What was the other paper? This is the
Well,
Ledge.
there was the Greenwood Ledge and there was the Boundary Creek Times, and both were good papers, and both in the same town, vying for essentially. Although Lowry himself had a wide reading all through the Kootenay boundary country. He had established ledges all over the place, and this float was not new to him. He had newspapers in Rossland, he had newspapers in Nelson, he had newspapers in Slocan City, in Sandon, and so on.
Yeah. Did you already say that it's the oldest mining camp newspaper in British Columbia? So he went where the mines were and published the kind of information they wanted to hear?
He followed the mining excitement, essentially.
I could look through this forever.
Oh, yes.
You can find how much prices had gone up.
Yeah.
Them. At any rate, it was a bustling, well-established, and still is, one of the smallest incorporated city in Canada.
Yeah. And maybe, we're not sure, it may be the smallest incorporated city in North America.
Okay. The courthouse, which still stands today, is just a fascinating place.
Yeah, sure it is. It was built in 1907, and at that particular time, Greenwood was still considered the government seat of the boundary country. And so the courthouse was very, very important, and they didn't waste much time in putting it up, and they spent lavishly.
Beautiful stained glass windows.
Sure.
And those rounded beams must have been the test of any carpenter.
Oh, marvelous work, oak and stained glass and everything all through the courthouse. It's really quite spectacular, and this shows the the prisoner's dock, and of course the prisoner's dock. The prisoner would walk right out of that dock and down those stairs, and of course he would walk straight into the cells below. And these are what the cells below look like.
Are cells still there to this day?
The cells are still there. You can go down to the bottom of the courthouse in Greenwood and examine the cells, and it's really quite a fascinating place, complete with resident ghosts, so they say.
The courthouse is still there today. There's also a post office there, which is beautiful with copper and everything in it.
Yeah, it's a very, very fine post office. You know, it chimes out the hour, and it's brick construction, typical of the very fine workmanship of the turn of the century.
This is what separates Greenwood from being a ghost town. It managed to stay alive. How? I mean, when copper mines close, they disappear the way gold locations
That's
did.
true, but a lot of the buildings were substantial, Mike, you know, and you still have a little bit of activity even today with various mines operating in and around the vicinity, and of course, you know, with the main street like it was, and most of the buildings never hit by a hard fire. So that Greenwood really didn't suffer. It did have fires, but usually the individual fires burned one or two hotels, but not the whole main streets. The whole main street has never been exposed to that. And then you have, you know, you have the city hall, you have the post office, you have a number of substantial residential buildings in Greenwood. It is really a very interesting town. The whole area, and you can see the old mining area around the city itself, and you travel east, west, north, and south in Greenwood, and you have lots of sites to look at there.
And I guess as far as the smelters are concerned, there's very little left of that, but what there is eerie to take a look at.
Yes, it is. It takes you back, you know, right back to about 1901, and one of the major smelter stack is still standing. So this shot was taken just a few years ago, and it's symbolic of the time when Greenwood was really the smelter center of the mining country in the Boundary.
And all the slag from those casings, you know, where they melted the ore and
Yep.
Very eerie, wonderful place to go.
Yeah,
and it rings like glass when you drop rocks on it.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay, take a break here, because in just a minute we'll come back to talk to you about a treasure story in the form of a lost mine. We'll do that right after these words. Back to Greenwood in a moment. Welcome back. Mike Roberts with Bill Barley, Gold Trails and Ghost Towns, looking at Greenwood. And I like the little collectibles that you've come up with, the shin plaster and some of the tokens, which were used as trade in these towns.
Sure.
Now, this one here is good for a quart of milk. This one here is good for 6 1/4 cents at the bar, and this happens to be the Clarendon.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these kinds of things. The Phoenix would put something out there, and this is good for 1 drink or a cigar.
Yeah.
Where'd you find these?
Well, some of those actually were found on an old tin. A guy was metal detecting in the area and came across a tin that was sealed, and there were some tokens inside, so I purchased all the tokens from him. And Greenwood man. And some were found under where the boardwalk was in Greenwood, and others were kept by people in the immediate area.
There is a lost mine story, which gets more attention than tokens very often. Tell me about it.
Yeah, several, but perhaps the most important is a lost mine goes by the name of the Harry Morgan mine. And he's a very interesting guy. He was a prospector. We don't know a lot about his background. Came from Chesaw, which was just across on the U.S. side in the state of Washington, and came in with a string of mules and was going to stake in the Boundary country, because after all there were 800 claims in that particular area when he came in just after the turn of the century. And he found that all the ground was staked. So how did he make his living? Well, he was essentially a prospector and a trapper. So he then decided to go up Boundary Creek. And that Boundary Creek runs right through, which we alluded to in one of the photographs, right through the city of Greenwood. But it stretches to the north for a number of miles. So he eventually went up Boundary Creek around 18 or 19 miles. We're not exactly sure how far, but around that distance. And he stayed up there and trapped to make a living, and stayed there for several years. And he would come in once or twice a year, usually twice a year, for supplies from Greenwood. And this one year, he came in, instead of for supplies, he made straight to an assayer's office, a man who was known as Gordon, Captain Gordon. And on the back of one of his mules, he had a sack of ore, in fact 2 sacks of ore, and he brought in these sacks of ore for assay. And so he left them with Captain Gordon for, I think it was a week. Returned a week later, and Gordon was astounded at the results of the assay, because the results were, it was between 400 and 500 ounces of silver per ton, which is exceptionally rich, and 5 to 6 ounces of gold per ton. And they weren't very narrow specimens or samples. They'd come from a wide vein. So he immediately told Morgan, he said, you better stake it right now. And for some reason, Morgan was a bit of a recluse, a diminutive man, kind of taciturn, not very friendly, generally speaking. He refused to stake the ground. And we don't know why to this day. But anyway, Gordon kept after him and finally said, he said, I better go up there and take a look at your mine. And he was completely trustworthy, this particular assayer, and this is why he'd been picked out by Morgan. So he made a date with Morgan to go up to the mine, and met him at a designated spot, and they started towards the mine, and suddenly, according to Captain Gordon's later recollections, Morgan bolted through the jack pines and simply disappeared. And he never saw him from that day on.
What in the world would it have been about? Is there any speculation?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of speculation about it, and there are several theories, but we don't know whether the theories fit the actual facts or not. If you took a look at that country, there are silver camps in the immediate vicinity. There's the Elkhorn, and there's the Providence camp, and the Skylark. And so there's silver and gold camps as well as, and it is a heavily mineralized area. So that other people went looking for the mine, and some would say that he cleaned out a hot spot in the area, or they got killed in the cave-in, or something else happened. We just don't know. So the mystery of the disappearance of Morgan has never really been resolved. But other people went looking for this particular mine in later years, Mike. And one of these guys was the famous Scott McCrae, who was probably the most well-known prospector outside of volcanic brown in the Boundary Country.
He was involved in Phoenix in some way, wasn't he?
Well, yes, to a degree. He was in Burnt Basin. He was in Phoenix. He was all over. He prospected all that area, and he looked for it for a number of years, gave up on it, and his place was taken by a man known as Vic Barrett, who was another trapper. And Barrett did not find the mine, but evidently he found a wheelbarrow that was pinned together, and they're quite sure, the locals are quite sure, that wheelbarrow originally belonged to Morgan.
So somewhere about 18 miles north of Greenwood on Boundary Creek is the Lost Morgan Mine.
Yeah, I think so, Mike, because a logging contractor in the early 50s in Kelowna was doing some work in there, came across a 4-foot vein of galena, which is a very good indicator, you see, because galena carries silver, lead, and zinc, and slashed several trees in the area so he could come back and stake the ground, and evidently logged over the whole thing. When he came back, he couldn't find it.
The Lost Morgan Mine. That's our look today at Greenwood on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Next week, who knows where we'll go, but we'll seek out another historic location in the British Columbia, Pacific Northwest area, and Bill Barley will be here to talk about it on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. See you next time.